So we are recording this session, and you will be able to view it on the Faith for the Climate website and also the CAFOD website. Just some housekeeping before I tell you a bit more about Faith for the Climate. As I said, all are on mute now, but if your cameras are on, that would be great, because it would be nice for our guest speakers to see that they're speaking to, a live and engaged audience. If there is a chance at the end, I will allow for you to unmute yourselves if there's time for the Q&A. But in the meantime, do park your questions in the chat box. I won't look at them at the moment, but when we do open for the Q&A at about 23, I will pick up the questions that are specifically for Christine or Jonathan or both of them, and I'll read them out. Apologies if we can't get through all the questions in advance, but please feel free to be in touch with us. There are different ways to get in touch with us. I'll go through that in a minute. So let me tell you a bit about Faith for the Climate. So we are a national, Giles, if you could maybe stop sharing that slide now, and I can tell people about Faith for the Climate. So let me just, so Faith for the Climate, let me know if you can see this, if you can see, yes, thank you, thumbs up there. So we are a national network of organizations and individuals who are committed to faith-based climate action. So any person of faith, or not, we have people who are not people of faith as well, but they're interested in the work of faith-based groups on climate action. These are our members, and they are individuals, they are small organizations or congregations, and some of the bigger ones as well. We are multi-faith, and we make room for different faith approaches and faith positions. As long as people are committed to climate action, they can become a member of Faith for the Climate. There is no membership fee. For now, how we are supported is we receive financial support from Green Faith and Religions for Peace UK. You can see their logos on our website. And now also the Gulbenkian Foundation. And we receive other kinds of support, some of it financial, from the big faith development NGOs, including CAFOD, which Christine is the director of, Christian Aid, Tear Fund, Islamic Relief, the British Quakers, and the Bridge at Waterloo, which is a charity that's based at St. John's Church in Waterloo, which our chair, Giles Goddard, is the vicar of, Canon Giles. So what do we do at Faith for the Climate? So you can see from the website, we do try and be a resource for as many different faiths as possible. On our landing page, you can see the different news articles that we try to highlight every month. So this month, we've been highlighting what a green Ramadan has been like for many of our Muslim partners experiencing it in lockdown. And we've just done a run through of the different activities that people have had. We've also just set up the events page. I won't be reading out the biographies of our speakers. I'm delighted to have them, but in the interest of time, you can go through the website as well, just to see who they are and what they've done, their track records and so on. We also have a Twitter feed, so do follow us, FFTC Network. This is where we tweet lots of our events, but also the events of our members and any other event related to climate action and faith all around the UK. And there's also a monthly e-news that we have that you can sign up to. And I'll put the link here. So please do sign up. So we have a monthly roundup of our updates. And finally, as of today, we have a fundraising page as well, because as you can probably tell by now, the lockdown and the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting people all across the charity sector, not least the faith-based charity sector. Lots of our partners are overstretched, having to deal with the fallout of the lockdown, vulnerable members of their communities, and also trying to keep climate action going. So the option today is, if you like what we do, please visit our GoFundMe page. I've just put the link in the chat box. And yes, any amount that you donate will help us to be able to transition into this difficult period and support the network members and partners that need that support. So that's it for now, Giles. If you would like to bring back up the slide when I stop my screen share. So I'm delighted that this first of our webinars is so well attended. Thank you, everyone. We were actually sold out and we have a limited Zoom account, so I was quite worried about what would happen if every single person turned up. But I'm really glad to see the vast majority of you here. As I said, this first session, we're going to have a focus on Laudato Si because it is Laudato Si week. But we're also going to make it a cross-faith conversation, which is why we have Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg to respond on Laudato Si from a Jewish perspective and also from a more multi-faith perspective. Now, before we start, I'd like to, Christine, very lovely to have you here. We'll be talking more about Laudato Si, but from my perspective, at least, what it's really done, and I'm taking the words of Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan friar, whom I really respect, who writes about the legacy of Laudato Si. And what he said earlier this week was, if we approach nature and the environment without an openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. And here, this is Richard Rohr quoting Laudato Si by Pope Francis from the encyclical. And this is where Pope Francis quotes St. Francis of Assisi. So he says, the poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. And I'll repeat that. Something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. And with that, maybe before we start, if we can take a moment of silence just to remember the conditions in which we're doing this webinar, where the pandemic is still affecting so many people who are made vulnerable by pre-existing inequalities. And it's often the same groups who also bear the biggest burdens of the climate crisis. So let's just take a moment in silence for meditations or prayers, or just to center ourselves. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So, with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce our guest of honor today, Christine Allen, who is director of CAFOD. As I said, you can read her bio on our Eventbrite page or on our website. But yes, so how this will work is I'll be asking Christine a series of questions that she'll respond to for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg for a response. So, Christine, welcome.
Thank you. I've never been welcomed as a guest of honor before. I feel really nervous.
Well, this is very fortuitous because this is the start of a series of webinars that we're going to do as well, which I hope CAFOD will very much be a part of as well in the future. So I'll say more about that afterwards. But for now, shall we just jump into it, onto the topic? Yeah, so I thought maybe I'd open by asking you, it's the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. We're going to be celebrating all over the world this Sunday, the 24th of May. But maybe tell us, what can people of faith take from Laudato Si now in a world that is so transformed by COVID-19 and yet still faces enormous challenges from climate change?
Thanks, Shannon, and yeah, great to be here. I've put together a few slides with some pictures, but yeah, we can move on that. And I think the one thing for me about well, Laudato Si, we're in Laudato Si week, which celebrates the 5th anniversary, but Pope Francis has also reminded us that we're actually starting a Laudato Si year. You know, a week's not enough. So we're working on it in this year. And this is going to be a year of significant change because we're adapting to a very new normal of the impact of the coronavirus. And we'll start to see some things that have been pushed back come back into hopefully as the political life and world gets back to its rhythm. And so I wanted to share a few pictures, because what do we think we can take from Laudato Si in a changed context? Well, you know something, the context is, it's brought to us into stark relief the inequalities and injustices that were already in our world. And it's brought home to us, I think, this new context, especially us in the rich West, where we've been very cushioned by the impact of climate change in many respects. And it's brought home to us that we are not impermeable, we are not, you know, unaffected by stuff. And so the kind of change in our context is a real wake-up call. And I thought your quote, your reference to Richard Rohr there right at the very beginning sums it up for me absolutely brilliantly, that it's this radical conversion. Pope Francis asks us to think differently, to act differently, and actually to be different in our contexts. And 5 years ago to today, so much has changed in the world, but those principles remain the same. So I've got this picture from Fabiano, who's someone in that CAFOD, in a project in Uganda that CAFOD supports. And you know, I was in this community and just last summer, and obviously from CAFOD's perspective, our concern about the environment is not just because of our responsibility to the earth, but because it is the people who are poorest that are most worse and most adversely affected by climate change. But it's people like Fabiano and his community who are so close to the earth also have stuff to teach us. And so part of that, that conversion that Pope Francis asks of us is to learn and to listen to the voices of those that we might not normally hear, the sort of small ones. So Fabiano and his community, the way they respond to the earth, the way they look after the earth, do have things to teach us. So on my next slide, I wanted to highlight this is the very nature of what Pope Francis and Laudato Si is asking for us. A new dialogue about how we're shaping the future of the planet. And the principles of Laudato Si and the nature of that new dialogue is as relevant, in fact, more relevant in a COVID world than ever. Because this virus has brought home to each of us our interconnectedness. It's highlighted those inequalities that already existed before. And the kind of crises that Pope Francis talked about in Laudato Si, an environmental crisis and a social crisis, are concern for the earth, but also the reality of poverty, are not two different and separate crises. They're one, and they're symptoms of a broken world. They're symptoms of that lack of awe and wonder. And it's that obsession with consumerism, individualism, profit at its extreme that Pope Francis has quite consistently talked about. And so he calls us to that change of heart. And I think we see that in our world. I mean, ironically, I don't know about you, but I feel almost more hopeful about the way in which we, and particularly faith communities, but the way in which we as a society have responded to this COVID virus. We're finding wells and reservoirs of kindness and compassion that, frankly, if 6 months ago, even 6 months ago, was missing in our toxic political environment, in our negativity. And actually there's a potential for sort of hope. And in some respects, the coronavirus context can teach us to find that space for a new way of thinking about it. And so Pope Francis asks us to build on that. He asks us to find a new heart, a new way of seeing things, and I think we're experiencing that now in a new way of being kind, a new way of reaching out, a new way of thinking about others, and it is a new relationship between one another and the earth. So I think in the context of coronavirus, there's a lot of opportunities for us if we can go back to the values that underpin Laudato Si.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, when you talked about hope, I agree that there are things like, the springing up of mutual aid networks now all around the UK. I think that's an example of kindness in action, and it's also tied to organizing. And that's one of the things about this encyclical, the way it links individual responsibility and action to collective action as well, and holding institutions to account. And I think we're seeing that in some of the mutual aid networks. And as you say, people of faith have informally been, doing mutual aid networks even before, especially those from more marginalized backgrounds and communities, right?
Yeah.
The equivalent of mutual aid networks. But the other thing also is, how the encyclical sort of links care for the environment with social justice on quite a global scale, and does that quite ambitiously. But just to move from that, so how we can apply that, and I'm thinking about, in this case, the UN conference on climate change, something like as big and bureaucratic as the UN conference, specifically COP26 that was supposed to happen in November this year in Glasgow. So why should people of faith care about COP26?
Well, as you say, Shannon, I think there's a number of different levels here, and one of the issues about COP26 is that it is the 5 years on, or the 6 years on from the Paris commitments, and it is about saying the world is recognizing that we want to make sure that we are on track, and I think this is about us holding our politicians' feet to that fire. And this picture is of a woman called Dona Maria. She's from a community in Brazil, and she is an example of why COP matters. Because the kind of decisions that get made at big political, bureaucracies, if you like, at the big political levels, have to be translated into what it means for people on the ground. For our government in the UK, we're talking with politicians about, well, what does net zero mean in practice in terms of our energy supplies, the job creation, the way in which we organise public transport. For people like Donna Maria, it's access to land, and it's about their ability to be able to kind of grow food, have food, and to be able to, in her particular instance, as a particular community as part of the Amazon, it's also about protection and defending the land that they've got. And this is an example. She's holding cocoa pods. The Catholic Church in Brazil, the Land Pastoral Commission, has been supporting communities, her community and others like them, to have access to land, have their rights recognised, and also to help them in terms of growing food and having agriculture at a way that is sustainable. So it's linking that local right the way to the global. And you can see it, I think, in the next picture too, in terms of it's not just individuals, it's about community responses. So this is tree planting in Kitui in Kenya. And there's ways in which we do our work that can be very dangerous and negative on the environment, or we choose to do them with a kind of sustainable way of looking at things. And Pope Francis calls it an integral ecology. It's seeing the connectedness and the impact of all that we do, whether it be planting trees or whether it be political change. And I think the reason why it matters is because throughout Scripture, all of our faiths are reminded that the earth is the Lord's. You know, we're looking after this planet. And at the heart of Laudato Si is obviously our relationship with God, and that we experience God in and through creation, and not as well as our relationship with one another. And that awe and wonder that you started us with is something that we've got to rediscover, and we've got to nurture it. So we have a sense of awe and wonder towards creation, which then takes us into a reality of responsibility towards one another, and therefore we have to do all that we can to protect it. Now, COP, I think the connection between, you know, what the COP means to most people is very minimal. And people might think, well, what have faiths got to do with the COP process? But I think back to 2015, and Pope Francis specifically wrote Laudato Si in order to influence that COP, or to inform those negotiations in Paris. He recognized how important that conference was going to be, and wanted to be able to bring a different kind of dialogue. And, you know, faiths were massively involved in the sort of year and a half, 2 years leading up to that COP. We all remember so many of the activities that we all did. But I remember sitting in that, you know, cavernous building of the conference centre, being lucky enough to hear the world leaders' opening speeches, and being absolutely stunned by the language that I heard. It was no longer just about politics. It was no longer just about economics. They talked about the moral imperative. And I was talking, you know, afterwards to civil servants saying, wow, you know, and you know, we've heard from diplomats and civil servants that Pope Francis helped shift the dialogue. And I think, you know, we need to build on that so much more. He exhorted us not just to make personal change, but to recognize the systems and the cultures and the policies that damage our earth, and as a result the poorest suffer the most. So we've all got to play our part, whether it be personal, but the political will still remains valid, because without politics, without that political will, as we saw in 2015, we're not going to bring about the scale of change and the ability of us as countries to be able to deal with it.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Christine. That's really really on point for me as well, because I think as Faith for the Climate, we were thinking about COP, you know, however people think about it, as an opportunity to build a movement, to sustain and grow a movement of climate activists, specifically what people can bring as people of faith, people of different faiths in this network. But now, you know, it's been postponed indefinitely. We don't know the new date for it yet. So what do you think of the extra time that we have now with this postponement? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all very conscious of the urgency, aren't we? So I think it's really important that we are, that we just feel and acknowledge our desire for urgency. But, you know, if the COP negotiations are really important things, and on, you know, on one level, I am really pleased that the COP has been pushed back, because, you know, it needs to have the necessary political action. It needs to have the detailed diplomatic kind of measures taken. It needs to be taken seriously. You know, if they were going to just like, oh, let's get it done, then, you know, we know that the bandwidth, the political bandwidth at the moment is incredibly small to talk about anything else except the coronavirus. So let's make sure that this is dealt with properly. And I think that, you know, as these pictures illustrate, we need to just get back to putting the pressure back on our politicians. And I think we can learn the lessons from the crisis. You know, we're hearing now in this crisis, people saying, but we can't just go back to the way it was. You know, whether it's about our relationship with animals and food, or the relationship with the climate, we're hearing more and more that from both scientists and from just ordinary people who are saying, actually, we're able to do this without traveling so much, or we're seeing more renewable energy being used. So I think, people are saying that we can't just go back to the way it was. So this is an opportunity that in 2008, when we had the financial crisis, we heard the same sort of thing, but unfortunately, we did go back to it. But hopefully we can continue to put pressure on our politicians to say, let's capitalize on the shock that this coronavirus offers us to change the system. And again, I think, we change the system based on those principles of Laudato Si, caring for the earth, having the right set of priorities, a new kind of economy. I've got a meeting, after this with Ed Miliband talking about the green recovery. This is exactly the kind of discussions that we've got to have. And we're seeing some of that already. But we now just have to put it in context. And I think being able to recognize the context of the coronavirus with the climate. So it doesn't look like we're kind of ignoring the context that we're in, but we're saying, actually, this context is teaching us that we can do things differently. And, people don't want to go back to the way it was before.
Yeah. The other thing that's making me think of is, you talked about hope earlier and, the lessons that we can learn, not wanting to go back to the normal that wasn't that great anyway before the crisis. But, there was that moment of hope with COP21 5 years ago in Paris. And that hope has slowly dwindled. It's fizzled out with a lot of foot dragging. And especially after COP25 last year in Madrid, there's been disappointment with that. What do you think is the specific role that people of faith can play now, bearing in mind these kinds of disappointments we've had in the run-up to COP, whenever it is, and beyond it, regardless of what happens? So any thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think there's different levels. The kind of programs, we continue to support programs in local people like Donna Maria and the community in Kenya to grow crops differently in a sustainable way, whether they be individual or community, kind of influencing people like DFID to carry on doing that. I think there are really big political choices. The pictures on the previous slide of the different kind of political and campaigning examples are very valid. We still need to have our voice heard. And I think we can, when there are conversations about what's the new kind of economy for which there will be, I think it's important that we enter into those kind of conversations with a kind of climate perspective, but also a kind of broader faith-based values perspective, because the values that we bring are really critical. And the virus, I think, has reawakened not just a sense of compassion, enabling us, but it's almost a kind of a desire for people to be searching for something. There was some research recently, I think Tearfund did it, where they were saying, more people were looking for kind of prayer and reflection resources than ever before. People who wouldn't dream of going into a church are kind of clicking onto online services. And this reflects to me a kind of hunger for the kind of values that we as faith-based people espouse and live out. And I think we're seeing that this week. So many churches are celebrating Laudato Si week. I'm sure that the faiths have been too, but we've been inundated with the kind of activities and prayers and witness that's going on. And I think we have seen a continued shift in the political consciousness. Climate change is much more a mainstream conversation, and I think we should use the space we have. I think there's a lot of work that's already that I'm sure people like Extinction Rebellion are continuing to think creatively about how they can do stuff, and we're all thinking creatively about the ways in which we can ensure that our voices are heard in a different context. So we've got different levels, personal and local, global solidarity. We've got Laudato Si week is not just an England and Wales thing; it's a global thing. We know that, and standing together as faiths in the political sphere, I think is so key. But of course, one of the things that is so important for us is prayer, is actually about bringing our awe and wonder at the joy of God's creation into our prayer lives. And, maybe sound terribly old-fashioned, but I'm a big believer in the power of prayer.
Well, amen. No, thank you for that. And talking about those levels, I mean, I'm a sociologist by training. So when people talk about levels of analysis, that's music to my ears as well. Like understand the level at which you want to make the change and the level at which you need to organize to achieve it. Thank you.
So that's why that last quote from the Pope on that next slide is so important.
Right.
They're not separate. It's together, and it's underpinned by our values, and it's underpinned by our joy in God's creation. So thank you, Shannon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Christine. Well, I hope you will stay on the call.
Oh yes.
Now, I would just like to bring in Rabbi Jonathan. Everyone, if you have any questions now, you can park them in the chat box. I'll get to them in a minute. But we'll give Rabbi Jonathan maybe 8 to 10 minutes to respond to that, Rabbi, if that's okay. I'll put the spotlight on you now. So, yes, welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. And I just so appreciate listening to you and to listening to you, Christine Allen. And there's not a word which doesn't chime right. There's not a word which I don't feel, as you put it, everything that you said makes sense to me. And also that's how I felt when I read Laudato Si. I'd begged the Jewish press to allow me to write a Jewish response to it. And I was given 24 hours between the publication and sending in my piece. And I read something which I thought was one of the outstanding pieces of moral and religious leadership of our era, really, in which every word chimed for me. And I'll say a little bit about that, and then just a little bit on, very much in agreement as to where I think we have to go. And of course, I think I want to emphasize your multi-faith organization taking many different groups with you, and that solidarity in the public square is so important in standing together and trying to convince our political leadership and the different cadres of leadership of our country that this is something all of us want to see action on. But I think why I felt at home with Laudato Si as a rabbi, as a Jew, is first of all because it's always been a passion for me to care about the world we live in. I love getting my hands into the soil as a keen gardener, but I've also been founder of Eco Synagogue, which really grew out of Eco Church, and I appreciate that relationship. It was with Ruth Valerio, who's now a head of Tier Fund, and also founded J-Tree Global for the Jewish community to participate worldwide in the important planting of trees, including in Kenya on Mount Kenya. So I appreciated that slide. But the Pope's words are so rooted in the Hebrew Bible, in the attitude to creation. Laudato, there's a wonderful Christian scholar, Ellen Davis, who's a brilliant Hebraist, who says that to work the land doesn't just mean to work, it has a spirit of reverence to it, a sense of what you talked about, awe and wonder, appreciation and honoring of the land. And in the Hebrew Bible, that is in exactly the way Pope Francis says, coupled with a sense of social justice. And only last week, at the close of the book of Leviticus, which is where we are in the annual cycle of readings, read about the sabbatical year in which fences come down, borders stop. And we've seen some of that, I think, during COVID-19. There's a sense of neighborhood. And we're told that we can't make profits from the land that year. You can't garner and store it. You go out and you eat it together with the passerby, the stranger, the refugee, domestic animals, and even the wild animals in your land. And that, even in an age when people were much closer to the land, that must have been a revelation of sharing. So I feel completely at home with the language of Laudato Si, and just so privileged that we are seeing such significant religious leadership. And I say that as a Jew with a sense of solidarity with Christians and Muslims and others who have a similar vision. Where should we be going now? I want to just say a couple of things. The new normal are two words framed in inverted commas, and which we're all very concerned about. And apparently early on in lockdown, there was a survey, I don't know who conducted it, which suggested that only 9% of people wanted to return to the status quo before this happened. 91% wanted something different. And the single biggest difference was our attitude to our environment, because people had seen more, noticed more, were more aware of small things. There was a wonderful piece in The Guardian where I think it was the borough of Camden had allowed people to write in chalk on the pavement the names of what normally would be seen as weeds, but are 147 species of wildflower. And this awareness, in Hebrew the word is da'at, it means knowledge, but it means knowledge of the presence of God in everything, is part of what has to shape our collective new normal, together with the sense of kindness and neighborliness, which Christine, you spoke about, which in Hebrew would be the word chesed, enduring, faithful, practical, loving kindness. And I think as religious leaders, we need to be taking those values as positive values out of our lockdown. Of course, my community and all our communities we've had bereavements and deaths, and there's a very painful side to it, but there's an inspiring side to what happened. We need to be in ourselves personally, in the decisions about our own lives, in our community leadership, but above all in the public square, we need to be saying that we want to help shape that new normal. And I don't think that as religious leaders, we should be siloed when COP26 comes around. And I think it's a very good thing that it's been delayed. And I probably shouldn't say something quite so political, but we might even get better leadership from the United States by the time it actually happens, and a better partnership. We want to be shaping that new normal, but we don't want to be siloed as religious leaders. I think it's terribly important that when the kind of meetings that are going to take place are arranged, religious leaders are partnered with policymakers, business leaders, people leading in the legal and teaching professions, and people working on the ground in agriculture, so that there's a cross-fertilization rooted in common values, and that it's not just thought, oh, let there be a little, a religious track, and one is sidelined. And I was delighted to hear, Christine, that your next meeting's with Ed Miliband about what the Labour view of green recovery should look like, because we need to be out there to act. And I'll close by saying, I just find Laudato Si a magnificent piece of inspiration as to where we need to be going with social and environmental justice.
Well done.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Jonathan. And thank you both for having a conversation that builds upon what's already there. I like the scriptural element that you tapped into so meaningfully as well, Rabbi Jonathan, because I'm a person of faith. We know religions get a bad rap sometimes. A lot of the time that's deservedly so. But I think what you've pointed towards is how we can tap into these deepest resources in our different faiths as well, to connect them, to care for the environment and political action, and to sustain that feeling of hope and that moral imperative, as Christine was talking about. So thank you both so much for that. Just in the interest of time, I will now just go through the chat box. Some of you have addressed your questions through me privately, which is, so I'll read them out, hopefully. We can get through as many of them as possible. So I'll start with Chris Martin, who says, and I think this is a question that's addressed to both of you, how and with what messages can faith communities and their leaders speak out to politicians and those in power? So it's a how question and the messaging that faith communities can use to speak to politicians and those in power. Christine, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think there are two ways, there's probably lots more, but there's two ways in which you speak. One is what you say, and the other one's what you do. So I think there is something really important about us recognizing that we have voices and we want to use it in the way that Pope Francis did in the COP. I mean, that was absolutely replicated right the way throughout churches very strongly. But over the last 5 years as well, lots of churches have been busy doing stuff, and I think James from Operation Noah is on the call, and that work around divestment has been so important. So we are as faith groups putting our money where our mouth is, as it were. So being able to sort of show what we're doing and being part of that global movement is a very important voice. I think in practical terms, to be sure, I mean, I know that we as CAFOD, and obviously there's the Climate Coalition that's been part of, that we're a part of, looking at its political strategy and trying to make sure that we've got religious leaders and engagement in that. We're hoping for a virtual lobby in the summer. Those sorts of things are really important ways in which we express our voices individually, but also we make sure that we're saying them as people of faith joined with other people of faith. And I remember, that was one of the very powerful things, and it got some very good coverage for the lobby, the Time Is Now lobby last year. So yeah, I think, and I think there's room where we're trying to help church leaders to make sure that when they can, to have their voices strongly heard. So yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan, would you like to add anything?
I'd just like to add, I appreciate exactly what's been said, that one of the great resources that faith leaders have is community. And community is something, the value, the understanding that community is important is something that's been going up in our society steadily, including during COVID-19. And we can speak and say that we are representatives of significant communities. We can justifiably say we're speaking in the name, not just of religious traditions, which nobody cares about, but with active communities whom we can mobilize. And like Christine said, we have to show that we are actually mobilizing them in practical actions. But I think that's something that politicians listen to. I have a senior civil servant in DEFRA who's a former chair of my community who I'm very friendly with, and I actually asked her, what makes a difference to politicians? And she said, in a democracy, politicians listen to what a significant number of whom they regard as ordinary people are doing and saying. And we have the capacity to mobilize such people, and we need to use it.
Thank you. Next question from Margaret Pitt. There are opportunities to show how COVID increases the need to tackle climate change, but also the pandemic is being used to draw attention away from actions that damage our Earth in rescinding environmental protection measures in the USA and Brazil, for example. How can we counteract this most effectively? So there's this idea that we don't want to go back to the old normal, but these actions are still there, taken by states, quite powerful states, in rescinding environmental protection. So Christine, would you like to go first?
Well, we've experienced that as CAFOD quite very, very acutely over the last kind of couple of weeks, particularly with the impact on Indigenous populations. And we've recently made more money available for our Brazil program to support some of the human rights and Indigenous defenders that have been really experiencing this. And I guess, we do have very particular sort of leaders in Jair Bolsonaro and Trump, and I think it is a very challenging environment. So, in some respects, it's very easy to be hopeless in the face of that. But I think again that the local social movements, the voices, the continuing to kind of stress what's out, and I think this is where the multilateralism of the UN process is important, that it is about peer pressure as much as possible. We know that both Bolsonaro and Trump don't really give two hoots about what their peers are doing, but there are plenty of oppositions within their own countries that do need as much support and solidarity as possible. And I think the churches are definitely playing, and faith communities are definitely playing their role in supporting those communities.
Thank you. Jonathan, anything to add?
I don't know, I appreciate that. I mean, can't really comment on South America. There's other than to echo and just all strength to your elbow, Christine, in what you're doing. In the States, it's very interesting that governors of states, mayors of cities, heads of universities and industry have said, well, I don't care what the president's saying. That's not the way we're going. In New York State, where there's been a lot of Jewish presence in it, has been, is working towards being completely carbon neutral very quickly. So I think supporting the the subgroups that are online with the agenda in any way we can, whether that's financial, whether that's moral, whether that's through solidarity, is the channel we have, and hoping that those leaders will get replaced.
Thank you both. Next question from Andrea Hayes. Is there a danger that there will be a big push to rebuild the economy after the lockdown that will suggest care of the planet is a luxury we can't afford? And how do we argue against this? And Christine.
Yes, I think it is a risk, but equally, I think we have reached a point in terms of both public and, to some extent, political opinion. I mean, it's still very divided. But I referenced, the meeting I have to go to in 10 minutes. There is thinking about what is the alternatives, and we'd already started that commitment. Both the government, this government had committed to net zero. We could have wanted them to do it faster. I agree, but the commitments are there, and I think it's important that we use our voice and we work with those who are pushing for an agenda that says this is an opportunity for us to, what in the technical term they're calling building back better, not just building back for the sake of it. So I do think it is about pushing that in practice, because we know as well that the time is running out in terms of the climate emergency and the need to be able to kind of take things forward there. So we have to keep the pressure on as much as we possibly can. I understand that there's a risk, but I do think there's a very strong momentum, and we just need to add our voice to it as well to make sure that happens.
Thank you. Again, Jonathan.
I'm a failure as a respondent because there's nothing being said that I disagree with. I just really appreciate that. I mean, I think the bottom line is that we can't afford not to. People may regard it as a luxury we can't afford, but I think this is mistaken. And there's more and more evidence that we absolutely cannot afford not to take the environment seriously. And there's a very, very good case to be made that COVID-19 is actually an environmental disaster at its heart. And it warns us about, its interconnectedness in a challenging way, which could be an interconnectedness in a much more benevolent way. And we have to build with that. Exactly said, build back better. One of the interesting things is that economics is turning, and money, unfortunately, is a great mover in the world. And people are realizing that they're simply, fossil fuels are bad investments. And talking as well as to political leaders, talking to business leaders, and financial leaders. And Mark Carney has been very aware of this, the previous government head of the Bank of England. These are also conversations we need to be having as faith leaders. And I think the leadership there is interested in those conversations. I think there's an open door, and we need to be going through it.
Thank you both of you. And I think it's fine to agree sometimes on issues like this. Well, I agree too. I'll just read this next one. It's a comment, and then I'll move to the next question so that we can take as many as possible. So from Annie Mary, this is an observation, who says, there is a growing movement of action involving local authorities and many groups and faith communities around the reallocation of highways to create safe space for walkers and cyclists, and this is related to COVID, but this also has significant potential for the development of more sustainable and active transport and reduction in air pollution and improved health and so on. And that will have holistic effects as well. So thank you for that, Annie. That's a really good observation. I'll just maybe we'll try this one. We'll see how long it takes for you to respond, but this might be the last question, or maybe the second to last. So this was a question from Giles Goddard, our chair, who says, can Christine and Rabbi Jonathan suggest one thing a faith community can do beyond prayer? So if you could just have one thing that faith community can do beyond prayer. So it's like Desert Island Discs, no Shakespeare, no Bible, but what else? So Christine.
Oh no. One thing. Well, gosh, because there's so many things actually that faith communities can do and are doing, So I think it's quite difficult to choose, because if I pick one thing, there'll be a shed load of people going, well, we've already done that, so what do we do next? So there are lots of things. I guess the one thing is know your power. So it is about, for me, Paulo Freire, the Brazilian sort of educator, uses this phrase, is when the poor realize their power, then their power will be made realized. And you know, I think that's part of it, is for each of us, we have so many different sort of spheres of influence and opportunities. Work out, either yourself as a person or within your community, what your power is and use it.
Thank you. Yes. And Jonathan, maybe a last word to you before we wrap.
So it's a very practical response. Here's a sermon from one kind of minister of religion to another that I've never dared to give. I half gave it, but one day I will, which is to take all the dustbins in the synagogue building and empty them out onto the pulpit and hold the objects up one at a time and say, why are these things here? And my comment would be waste less, because that concerns our consumption of food. It concerns the whole packaging industry, but it also concerns the way we travel and the way we understand our need. And it's the transformative perception between seeing the earth as our rubbish bin and the earth as a place of wonder. Mm-hmm. And I think those are actions we can take on. One can start on a small scale in one's own kitchen. One can go to one's community kitchen. And of course, food in the Jewish community is an enormously important thing. I'm sure it is in all faith communities, iftas and so on. And then from that, the way one lives. And at this point with COVID-19, I think a lot of people have actually realized there are things I don't need that I thought I needed. I'm perfectly happy without them. There are also things which we very much miss, but we're perfectly happy without them. So I would build on the waste less as a practical thing.
Yes, well, thank you. I think we will, that will be the final question. I'm sorry, everyone else. There were some amazing questions I saw. I'm sorry I can't get to them. But just to round up, I think that was a brilliant place to end, actually, because what both of you are saying is that it is interconnected. The two crises, COVID-19 and the climate crisis, they show how interconnected and complex the situation is. And it can feel quite disempowering sometimes for everyone, people of faith, not of faith. But I think, Christine, what you pointed out was we must never forget that we have a role. As interconnected and complex as it is, the worst thing you can do is defeat yourself before you get into the struggle. And I really like that. And I think that's a really good place to end this. Just before we finish, thank you both. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
Just in the interest of time, because I promised that we would end at 3 o'clock promptly. We're planning to, everyone, now this is for everyone, we're planning to do these webinars quite regularly, hopefully monthly. And I said, you know, there will be a combination of Q&As like this and perhaps more skills building, movement building ones as well, and possibly bigger conferences in the future. But just to get a sense, you know, with the lockdown continuing, possibilities that, you know, it might be relaxed a bit, the restrictions, what kind of times would work for you? So this is just a quick poll for you to answer this question. What times would you prefer for our future webinars or other online events? You're allowed to click both answers if both work for you. I'll give it just maybe half a minute more. I see you responding. Ooh. So there's kind of consensus for an afternoon session, although there's quite a sizable number that would prefer evenings. So just final 5 seconds for those of you who haven't voted. And okay, I'm going to end the poll now. We've got 53 out of 59 voted. Thank you. 79% of you said you'd prefer the afternoon. 47% said the early evening, but that's because you have a choice of both options. So thank you very much. And those are the results. And as I said, we're planning to have this as a series. Our June webinar will be hosted by Kamran Shazad, our outreach lead, who also works with the Bahu Trust. We'll send out dates and the exact topic soon. It will be a cross-faith conversation again. And as I said, more information on our website and social media. Just contact us if you'd like this and want to know more about our work. And yeah, if you want to donate, there was the GoFundMe link that I put in the chat box earlier. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to go back into gallery view so that I can see all of you. Yes, right. So thank you. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And for a wonderful, rich conversation. And thank you to the Faith for the Climate team for a stellar job, and to all of you for your questions and for your presence. So well done. Whatever you're doing, however you're coping, you're doing great. So yeah, and for those of you celebrating Eid this weekend, Eid Mubarak and happy Laudato Si Sunday.
Yeah.
See you at the next one.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.